Hi there, David Jameson here, editor at conta.co.uk, and we are continuing our coverage of the suspension of Jeremy Corbyn from the Labour Party with a conversation with Sai Englert, who is a socialist activist and a scholar on subjects including anti-Semitism, neo-colonialism, Zionism, and an active anti-racist, and someone who has contributed a lot to the left's understanding of anti-racism and anti-Semitism in contemporary politics. Thanks very much for joining us, Sai.
Thanks so much for having me.
Obviously this conversation is taking place against the backdrop of the suspension of Jeremy Corbyn for his statement yesterday, where he said he accepted criticisms of the handling of anti-Semitism complaints in the Labour Party by the EHRC, but that he believed that the report didn't take into account the fact that the accusations of anti-Semitism had been blown up and weaponised in the media and in a campaign against the left. This was his kind of general argument. He's since been suspended. We don't know yet why or on what justification he's actually been suspended. Sai, I just wanted to talk to you about the general political context and the consequences for the left and what the left needs to do now. I mean, how would you characterise the campaign against Corbyn in these terms? I mean, how should people understand this issue?
Well, I mean, look, let me just start by saying that I think Corbyn could not have characterized it better, right? Is that it's absolutely clear that the issue of anti-Semitism has been used as a battering ram against him, against the left, and against the left, I think that's been constituted, which he really represented for sort of, perhaps 2 decades, very much around questions of anti-imperialism, solidarity with Palestine, opposition to the war, which in fact was also very much directed towards the right of the Labour Party. And I think what the particular suspension now shows is really what the entirety of the leadership of Keir Starmer has been, which is that I don't think Keir Starmer is necessarily a leader that will ever contest an election, or that's particularly the question. I think he's a leader who's going to clean up and whose entire strategy is to crush any remnants of the possibilities, and however deep those possibilities were or are is perhaps a different question, but any possibility of a return of what Corbyn represented, could have been, what the Labour Party could have become. And that's obviously dangerous for the left. It's dangerous for that anti-imperialist kind of movement more generally. I think it's actually also dangerous for the Jewish communities in Britain that are being sort of mobilized in this particular way. Barnaby Raine spoke, I thought, very well on Newsnight yesterday and made exactly that point. But I think it's important to understand it that way, because I think it's concerning to see, the likes of John McDonnell coming online to immediately tell everybody that they will defend unity. And I think this is an absolute misreading of what's going on. There is no misunderstanding here. There's this sense of everybody's acting in good faith. There's a sort of misunderstanding. There is no misunderstanding. There is a clear campaign to not only drive out the leadership of the Corbyn project, but also, and more importantly, its base, I think, and to get rid of these hundreds of thousands of people who joined with ideas that, the Labour Party was going to represent them, that it could break with the kind of traditions of new Labour and the kind of old politics that Corbyn opposed. And what's happening right now, I think, is yet another attempt to accelerate that. And we've seen a whole number of them, right? The kind of response to the Black Lives Matter demonstration, the vote on not prosecuting British soldiers who commit war crimes abroad, the kind of one nation, one family turn of the Labour Party, etc. I mean, all of these things, the kicking out of Rebecca Long-Bailey from the shadow cabinet. I mean, time and time again, there are further provocations, attacks on this broader left in the Labour Party. And I think this is the most serious and most all-encompassing one, and one for which there's, I'm sure people have seen the clip of Tony Benn circulating. I often think that the parallel with Benn is a little bit mean to Corbyn. I think Corbyn was much more progressive on many questions than Benn ever was, but there's certainly a long tradition of going after the kind of representatives of a left challenge in the Labour Party in order to clean out their base. And I think that's what's happening now.
I think that's an interesting point you make about it being part of a more general turn to the right, because we are seeing what is obviously a turn towards a more racist policy broadly inside the Labour Party, a turn towards a more kind of pro-imperialist policy, immunity for British soldiers involved in torture and so on. And this is naturally being dressed up as, no, this is a move towards tolerance. This is a move towards a more egalitarian attitude, which is how these kind of witch hunts happen now. There was a time on the left, of course. If this were 100 years ago, the attack would have been, well, the left is a conspiracy organised by Jewish interests and so on against Western Christian Europe. 100 years later, the attack is, the left are all racists, the left are all bigots, and all sorts. And of course, it's going on around the world. So within an hour of Jeremy Corbyn being suspended from the Labour Party, there were fresh allegations against Bernie Sanders in the United States. Despite the fact that he is himself a Jew, it doesn't apparently matter for these attacks. Jean-Luc Mélenchon has also had his reputation trashed. Within about an hour of Corbyn being suspended, a list of Labour MPs was submitted to the leadership office saying these people also have to be investigated, with a heavy hint that they need to go as well, including left-wing MPs, but also including Angela Rayner, the deputy leader of the party. Who knows if Starmer will bail her out. But I mean, my feeling is that yesterday was the day Corbyn was suspended was a very bad day for anti-racism in Britain. One of its key champions of anti-racism over decades has been suspended from his own political party, hounded in the press once again. And there's this phony anti-racism taking the place of a real tradition of militant anti-racism.
Right, and which is, I think it says something about the particular political position that Jewish communities are being put in for the moment, which, as you say, is very different from sort of 100 years ago, right? 100 years ago, Jewish communities were constructed as the absolute enemies of Western civilization. And it sort of went in both ways, either as dangerous Bolshevik revolutionaries or as sort of blood-sucking capitalists, globalists, etc., that were going to destroy the Western nation state. Now, some of that latter imagery has survived and is certainly returning, particularly around the kind of the political right, including in the UK. And I think, one of the real dangers of this current narrative is that that's being totally ignored, right? Is that the kind of the political networks around the Tory party, in fact, around the right of the Tory party, right? That Boris Johnson was certainly very amenable to, his kind of meetings with, what's his name? Trump's former advisor,
Steve Bannon.
Steve Bannon, thank you. Who's trying to unify the right, etc. The fact that Theresa May can unveil a statue to a Nazi collaborator and admirer on Parliament Square as everybody celebrates the kind of...
And the Tory party is in a European alliance with Viktor Orban's party in Hungary, and they have this whole anti-Soros campaign, which harks very strongly on these sorts of anti-Semitic themes.
Totally. So on the one hand, that kind of survives and I think is being strengthened by growth of the right. And on the other hand, there's a use of Jewish communities by equating them with Zionism. So there is no longer any difference between Jews around the world end the Israeli state. And in that equation, using Jewish communities as a hammer really against all other victims of racism. So that who is being identified as dangerous, it's repeatedly primarily Muslims and other kind of communities that are victims of racism, that are seen as particularly dangerous because of their opposition to imperialism, because of solidarity with Palestine. And the left is sort of part of that broader kind of attack, where Jewish communities are equalized with Zionism on the one hand, and therefore constructed in opposition to the left and other racialized groups. And I think that's extremely, extremely dangerous. On the one hand, obviously it fuels anti-Semitism, right? Because it actually is an anti-Semitic argument. A, all Jews are responsible for the actions of the Israeli state. And B, you sort of have to choose between the left anti-imperialism, anti-racism, or fighting anti-Semitism, which is obviously nonsensical. And what that allows is A, using Jews, I think, as a shield behind which the state and racist politics can hide. And on the other hand, as a weakening of a general anti-racist movement, which in the long term is obviously bad for everybody, including Jews, as we've just said. The growth of the far right, although not primarily built on anti-Semitism today, it's primarily built on sort of a triple, Islamophobia on the one hand, xenophobia and fear of migrants on the other, and a kind of attack on Black communities is constructed as hyper-criminal and dangerous and whatever on the other. That the right that is building on that, those kind of three main branches of its general racism, is obviously also stoking up anti-Semitism. And in fact, all the numbers show it. One of the things that I find amazing around all these reports and these things, etc., is that beyond the headlines, for example, if you look at the reports of the CST, which is the kind of the main organization, security organization of the Jewish community in Britain, every single year it releases a report, which is actually fairly credible. Well, not fairly, it's credible, it's a good report. And it tends to have in its introduction sort of highlights where we'll say things, for example, about Corbyn when he was leader, etc. And then you look at the numbers, and the numbers are extremely striking. Every year, the growth in anti-Semitism and the vast majority of attacks are committed, first of all, by white men. So the idea that the Muslim community, for example, is particularly kind of dangerous, etc., is just not borne out in the numbers. And the vast majority of politically motivated attacks always come from the far right. And we're talking about the vast majority, right? And so on the one hand, you have these organizations that publish these reports that show us where the problem lies. And on the other hand, the leadership of many of these organizations participate in disarming our ability to fight back effectively, which, Corbyn at the head of a party that certainly doesn't have what could be called a good record or a positive record on anti-racism or anti-imperialism, was actually a real step forward to be able to tackle the growth of that right, which is being destroyed with a language that says it's doing the opposite. And it's obviously outrageous, but perhaps more importantly, it's extremely dangerous, I think.
Yeah, I think it was so apparent this morning how dangerous this was, because you have the Daily Mail, the House Journal of British Racism, basically, with a headline that says, R.I.P. Corbyn, and goes on about, his anti-Semitic influence and all this kind of stuff over the country. Famously, the paper that supported the black shirts. But to delegitimize active, progressive, egalitarian, anti-racist figures and movements in favor of viciously reactionary institutions like the Daily Mail, to ignore the threat of the far right, which we know all over the world is expanding. When I was a child, right-wing terrorism of the kind that has frankly become frequent in the United States, which we've seen in places like New Zealand, where it's never had a strong foothold before. A British MP was murdered by a white supremacist anti-Semite terrorist. This has become an actual feature of life in Western liberal democracies, and in a way that it really hasn't since the 1930s and 1940s. Right in the middle of that phenomenon, to whip up this campaign against one of the individuals who's risen to the top of political life in the West, who has the program and the record and the political attitude which can galvanize society against divisive, racist, against these very same forces, and to destroy them with the claim of racism, I agree with you, is wildly dangerous. And not, this is also, that there's a political mood of essentialization around communities. We see it incidentally. It's a huge issue that I'm not really getting to talk about because of what's going on in Britain, but what's going on in France. And if you look at the rhetoric around France, everyone has dropped the recognition that very few Muslims living in France agree with the kind of ideas that the people doing these attacks have. Very few Muslims agree with those attacks. But if you read the headlines coming out of France now, it's all about how Muslims must change in France, about the culture clash between the French and the Muslims, and all this stuff. There's a powerful trend of essentialization going on in Western politics, where, as you say, the claim is made constantly that Israel represents all Jews around the world, and all Jewish people are committed to Israel. And you are never told that these fake racial essentialisms actually are being overlain upon complex communities with internal divisions, class divisions, political divisions, ideological divisions, religious divisions that every community has. And so we're just getting a picture of the world as a mosaic of the Westerners, the Christians, the Muslims, the Jewish communities, though these things were all homogenous and share identical ideologies. I feel that with what's going on with Corbynism and this wider atmosphere, we are, Western societies are creating an atmosphere that is utterly deadly, and it's quite terrifying. But this is also why I think the left has to be fearless in this very difficult situation. They're trying to isolate and destroy Jeremy Corbyn, and if they can do it to him, they will do it to numerous others. But also an argument has to be made. This whole language and culture around politics is utterly vicious and dangerous. And what we need is the kind of politics that someone like Jeremy Corbyn represents. Militant opposition to reaction, combined with demands for human equality and social progress. And figures like Starmer want to stamp out the belief that progress is possible, and that a militant active politics that fights for it is possible.
I think that's really crucial at this moment, because you made the comparison between Corbyn and people like Mélenchon in France or Bernie Sanders in the US. And of course, broadly speaking, I agree with that, and they're being attacked, etc. But none of them have been attacked like Corbyn, because none of them have his politics. And what's extraordinary, I think, about Corbyn and his sort of, this sort of almost historic accident that gets him to be at the head of the Labour Party, which is probably the most reactionary of the kind of social democratic parties, with the best political track record, is that none of them have a kind of politics that on the one hand puts forward basic class politics. We can discuss about how far he was willing to go, but a basic level of a need to redistribute wealth downwards, recognizing that all wealth will not trickle downwards by letting capital run riot, and that instead it needs to be at least disciplined, and there needs to be a level of redistribution of wealth, with a long-term commitment to anti-imperialism and anti-racism. And Mélenchon can certainly not talk about that. On the contrary, his great weakness is his sort of, pro-imperialist republicanism, that, his kind of stance on the question of Islamophobia in France is a catastrophe. And Sanders, obviously in a different way, but, for example, his position on Israel being forced to the left by his movement, but certainly doesn't represent the kind of long-standing commitment. And I think the danger right now is that under the barrage of continuous attack, people start thinking, well, what was important or what we need to defend in the Labour Party or in the left more generally is this sort of, you know, the class element of the Corbyn project, and the other stuff is too complicated. And in fact, the reason he's being attacked so violently is because it's the combination of those two things that is so unbelievably powerful. And that if we start accepting now, as I worry sections of the left are prepared to do, that things like solidarity with Palestine, the centrality of Palestine to the broader kind of imperial chessboard of the Middle East, the question, the centrality, the importance of British imperialism in a British capital more generally, and therefore of anti-imperialism in fighting back against the domination of British capital, that all these questions, the centrality of racism, it's difficult to look at the politics of the last 20 years across Europe, North America, etc., and not be struck by the fact that the question of anti-racism has repeatedly brought out, and obviously very recently, you know, millions of people in fighting back against their own states and making the links of kind of international solidarity. And the absolute danger right now is that we sort of accept an idea that the Labour Party is clearly in a process of change. There's this incredibly paternalistic idea, insulting idea, I think, to working class people, right? That if Labour wants a working class vote, it needs to become a racist party, as if, you know, working class people are these kind of foaming at the mouth racists waiting to be able to beat up migrants and Muslims. Which again, I think the popularity of Corbyn demonstrated to be an absolute sort of fallacy and nonsense. And that in fact, what we need to defend absolutely and clearly against the leadership of the Labour Party, as well as against the Tories, is a kind of politic that says that there can't be any separation between class politics, the fighting of your against the domination of capital on the one hand, and anti-racism and anti-imperialism on the other. And it's not for nothing that the question of Palestine was so central in the attacks against Corbyn, because it's been so central in bringing all these different strands together in British politics for at least 20 years, if not longer.
Yeah, I think you've put it really clearly, Sai, you know, because there will be some people on the left who are duped into this idea that they are being serious about anti-racism by chucking Corbyn under the bus. You know, I think that people need to be reminded of the consequences of what will happen here, and that there are people who are prepared to split these issues. You know, anti-racism from working class politics, anti-imperialism from domestic affairs. This is a kind of traditional Labour trope. But ultimately, the people who want to split these things aren't serious about any of them. You know, I've noticed, for example, that a lot of people who say that they are socialists, you know, the kind of sort of blue Labour people, for example, who always go on about this. Get rid of these fringe issues and just talk about social class. When it comes down to the class issues, they've got no progressive politics, and hey presto, they've not stood by Jeremy Corbyn, the only person who's been serious about bringing a pro-working class project to the Labour Party in my lifetime. So I think it exposes that argument as what it is, you know, reactionary. But that cuts both ways. Like I say, you know, people saying, well, you know, Corbyn's good on class, but he needs a lesson or few, you know, on sensitivity around issues like racial oppression. Far from it. He could teach them a few things as someone who has actually fought ceaselessly against racism, against apartheid, against the far right. You know, I dread the rise of this copy and paste equalities version of politics, which is really the politics of kind of boardrooms and middle class respectability, but has no actual commitment to liberation whatsoever. I keep thinking about this. I mentioned it in the video yesterday. This comment I saw by one of the editors of a Jewish socialist magazine, who said, every time I've been on an anti-racist demonstration in London, Jeremy Corbyn has been there, and I've never seen any of his accusers on any of these demonstrations. So it's a choice. There is a choice here between a dead letter version of support for equality on all axes, race and sexuality and nationality, religion, all axes, a dead letter, middle class respectability politics version of this, which I'm sure Keir Starmer's happy to sign up to and weaponise when it suits him, and an actual militant commitment to anti-racism, which hasn't always been very present on the British left, but which people like Jeremy Corbyn helped to cement into political traditions here in the last 20 or 30 years.
Yeah, and certainly hasn't been present in the Labour Party. But you know what I was really thinking about when you were saying, the thing about essentialism, I think is so important in how there's this idea of, well-thinking people on the left who think, well, yes, there is this problem of anti-Semitism, etc. And what keeps coming back is this idea of like, well, the Jewish community has said this and the Jewish community has said that. And there's this complete collapse of official leadership bodies like the Board of Deputies. And I think I know the editor of the Jewish Socialist magazine you're talking about, who often makes the point, of course, that the Board of Deputies is largely a Tory organization, that many of its members are card-carrying members of the Tory party, and that they represent a particular class section of Jews in Britain. And that's always been true of the kind of the leadership of different communities. And, that's not just true for the Jewish community. It's true if the MCB is hardly the paragon of the left of the Muslim community either, right? They are people who have a proximity to power, but are also pushed away from it because of racism, and that think that the way out of racism is to get a seat at the table, right? And, I've written about this, that particularly in the kind of aftermath of the 67 war, Zionism became a way for the ruling class elements inside of the Jewish community in the West to get closer to that seat at the table of power. In fact, Norman Finkelstein, in his book Knowing Too Much, traces very powerfully. He says the Jewish community, the leadership of the Jewish community in the United States, turned to Zionism because of its Americanism rather than the other way around. Is that it was its desire to be integrated into the American elite that led it to support Israel, which in fact it had very much rejected before because it was scared of being accused of having dual allegiances. And so that when the United States formally enters in an alliance with Israel, the leadership of the Jewish community in the United States sees that as an opportunity. And there's a real danger, I think, in collapsing, for example, the Jewish community in the Board of Deputies. Throughout the history of the Jewish community in Britain, the Board of Deputies has not been the organization that has led the struggle against racism and against anti-Semitism. When thousands of working class militant Jews bravely stood up to the British Union of Fascists in Cable Street, the Board of Deputies was telling them to stay home, don't make trouble, don't go to the demonstrations, don't confront fascism, exactly in the same way as the Muslim Council of Britain tells Muslims today when the EDL tries to march through their neighborhoods or attack their mosques, etc. Because there is a similar logic. And I think on the left as well, we need to move away from this idea that communities are these uncomplicated, unified bodies that can be spoken about for, etc., in these kind of unified ways. They are, like you said, divided around class lines, political lines, religious lines, cultural lines, whatever. And so I think we should be serious as well about recognizing who our allies are in different kind of communities. And so the very vibrant left inside of the Jewish community, which has spoken out repeatedly and is sort of battered away as a bunch of insane, loony lefties, etc., that represent nothing, etc. I think that's very dangerous also because it again reinforces this idea that there is a nicely unified, perfect Jewish community that the Board of Deputies perfectly represents despite its rather lacking democratic institutions, and therefore that, well-thinking lefties can say, well, look at what the Jewish community is saying. Lots of Jews have said lots of different things, and in fact, Corbyn has stood throughout his life with the sections of the Jewish community that have taken seriously a struggle for socialism, for liberation, for anti-racism across the board, have not made a difference between anti-Semitism and other forms of racism, stood up to fascists when they marched through London, and Corbyn was there with those Jewish groups to fight back at the time where these kind of leaderships were certainly not prepared to do it. And so there is no, I think it's important, this idea that there is no essential unified Jewish community. There are lots of different political traditions within it, just as there anywhere else. And the idea that there isn't is actually pretty racist, this idea that there's this sort of undifferentiated community, as well as dangerous for the kind of reasons we've said before, I think.
Okay, Sai, that's been fascinating talking to you. Thanks very much for bringing those thoughts.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
And ask viewers to subscribe to this YouTube account, to share this video if you agree with it, put a comment underneath the video, and ask all our viewers as well just to be prepared to fight against these attacks and to not allow Corbyn or anyone else on the left to be victimised in this way. You can follow us as ever at conta.co.uk, and I look forward to speaking to you all again soon.